All right, last week I did receive some feedback, and of the feedback I received, unanimously, those who gave feedback suggested that we move our Ecclesiastes class to Sunday morning and our church history study to Wednesday nights. And so that is effective today. So starting today, we are studying Ecclesiastes, and then on Wednesday night, we will have our church history study. So last time we had our Ecclesiastes study, we left off in chapter 8, verse 10 and 11. We have been discussing how that Solomon has observed through his experiences, through his observations, through the wisdom that God gave him, many truths that lead to the understanding that under the sun, this life is nothing but vanity. But in fact, it is the one who trusts in God, the one who puts his hopes in God and does the works that God tells him to do, understanding the nature of this life, that ultimately has profit. And so, as we talked about last time in verse 11, because the sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily, therefore the heart of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil. This is, in the context, it would appear to be talking about under the sun. Granted, there is the sense in which certainly that since God doesn't strike down someone as soon as they sin, that emboldens individuals to continue to commit sin. But Solomon says this in a way that this is a bad thing. This is an unfortunate thing, and certainly God choosing to not execute a sentence on us the moment that we sin, that's not a bad thing. That is long-suffering, and that certainly is in accordance with his promises through the new law. But the way Solomon is discussing this in its broader context is under the sun, especially as it pertains to the kingdoms of men. And so the recognition is this idea, and of course earlier here throughout this is this constant give and take between the wicked and all that they enjoy in their life. And in contrast, you have the righteous, who are also kind of synonymously used as the wise. They're wise because they seek to be righteous in the sight of God. This constant contrast in all these different scenarios. And granted, earlier in chapter 8, we have the situation of kind of as citizens in this world, as citizens in man's kingdoms under the sun, and our responsibilities there. He goes on to say in verse 12, though a sinner does evil 100 times and his days are prolonged, yet I surely know it will be well with those who fear God, who fear before him. But it will not be well with the wicked, nor will he prolong his days, which are as a shadow, because he does not fear before God. This concept of prolong his days, it doesn't necessarily mean that that person won't live a long time. That's not what Solomon's specifically saying. He's saying that the blessings of God will not be with him. Okay, whether that equates to him living a long life because of blessings from God, or because that life will be full of great things. The idea is, though a sinner does evil 100 times, it doesn't matter how much evil a person may do, they're not going to gain anything from God because of it. They're not going to have any help in this world because of the evil that they do. That's why he says there in verse 12, his days are prolonged, yet I surely know it will be well with those who fear God, who fear before him. Because Solomon's considering the broader picture. The big picture is that in the long run, those who fear God, those who serve God and keep his commandments, these are the ones who are ultimately going to be blessed. May not always be apparent in the physical life under the sun. In fact, because of our faith and our willingness to serve God, we might actually have despair and hardship under the sun, and our lives very well might not be prolonged. In fact, they might be shortened because of our fear of God. But in the end, this profit will be to those who are wise and righteous. Verse 13, it will not be well with the wicked. Sometimes we sing the hymn, it is well with my soul. Okay? And of course, the focus of that entire hymn is about the soul. And the whole backstory of that hymn is really it's kind of a sad story looking back at how that hymn came to be and who wrote it and why and his family, how they died. But that whole situation, despite his emotional state, the hymn writer of that hymn focused in on the fact that it is well with my soul. And so despite how the sea billows roll and despite how terrible things may be now, as long as I'm serving God, everything's going to be fine. And that's what Solomon is observing here. It will not be well with the wicked, nor will he prolong his days, which are as a shadow. Not that wicked people are going to die young. That's not what Solomon means. He already says in verse 12, though his days are prolonged. It's that in the broad scheme of things, no matter how long he lives, first of all, it's always going to be like a shadow. It doesn't make any difference. And he's going to focus in here in chapter 9 on the fact that they're all going to die. There's nothing they can do to prevent that. So when he says in verse 13, nor will he prolong his days which are as a shadow, there will be no help from God. There will be no blessings towards him. There will be no answering of prayers on his behalf. There will be nothing from God that will help him in this life, certainly, but most definitely in the next. And it is to that Solomon is speaking in verse 13. He will not prolong his days, which are as a shadow, because he does not fear before God. Again, in the end, Solomon has, the end result is the big picture. There are times, in fact, there's a couple hymns that we sing that describe how that sometimes we observe that in this life, it seems that people who do evil, they seem to have the wealth, they have the power and the influence sometimes, and how unfair that seems under the sun. Because they're doing everything the wrong way, and yet they're prospering, and yet we seek to do everything God's way, and sometimes we don't feel like we prosper at all in this life. And Solomon's accounting for that understanding that sometimes the wicked are going to prosper. And sometimes they're going to prosper because they're wicked. But in the end, God is not with them. God will not bless them and he will not be with them. He will be with those who fear him. Anything through verses 12 and 13. Verse 14. There is a vanity which occurs on earth, that there are just men to whom it happens according to the work of the wicked. And again, there are wicked men to whom it happens according to the work of the righteous. I said that this also is vanity. So as he's gone through these 8 chapters so far, and he's observed things that are useless, profitless, vain, vanity, of these lists that he's kind of accumulated over the period of 8 chapters so far, some have been directly attributed to life in the sense of life itself, outside of any human involvement. Just this is how life works sometimes. Not because anybody means for it to happen, it just happens. And then sometimes he observes this from the perspective of human influence. You know, this happens sometimes because man gets involved. And here in verse 14, it's interesting because what he says is, there is a vanity which occurs on earth, which you might as well be saying under the sun, okay? Because he's pointing out that this isn't God's favor upon the wicked, and this isn't God's punishment on the righteous, that this is just how life works sometimes. That there are just men to whom it happens according to the work of the wicked. What does that mean? That there are just men to whom it happens according to the work of the... What's the work of the wicked? What does that mean? Okay. Ultimately, it's the end result of what the wicked do. That often when the wicked sin, who most often is affected negatively? The innocent. The innocent, and whether the righteous or just people in general who have nothing to do with the situation, they are negatively affected and they are often hurt and sometimes killed because of the deeds of the wicked. And this is something that Solomon specifically applies between the righteous and the wicked. There are wicked men who prosper and who receive all of the reward that you would think under the sun that should go to the righteous. Instead, it goes to the wicked. Those who should be praised, okay, you think about Esther and Mordecai, okay, ultimately, one of the reasons why the story of Esther and Mordecai is such a compelling one and kind of hits home is because we feel like Mordecai received his just reward of being acknowledged for the good person that he was, whereas, what's his name, the guy who was his nemesis? Haman, thank you. Haman received his just reward as well, being hung in his own gallows. Okay, that's kind of one of those, it's one of those accounts that really just kind of sticks with you because ultimately justice was done, both ways. Well, what Solomon describes is that sometimes it happens, what would it be like if the way that account went was Mordecai was hung on the gallows and Haman got paraded through the streets? Okay, that's how it sounded like it was going to turn out there for a little while, at least as far as Haman was concerned. That was his intention of what he planned to happen. And Solomon says sometimes that does happen. There is a vanity which occurs on earth, that there are just men to whom it happens according to the work of the wicked. Sometimes they're in the wrong place at the wrong time. Sometimes they end up suffering the proper punishment that is due to the wicked, but somehow the wicked weasel themselves out of it, or life happens in such a way that it just falls on the righteous. And then as he says, there are wicked men to whom it happens according to the work of the righteous. Men who may not deserve a second notice or a second mention get praised or get ultimate riches and so many blessings under the sun, on this earth, he says in verse 14. When you would think that should be going to people who are of upstanding character, people who deserve it. And yet, that's not how it works many times. Go ahead, Lisa.
Yeah, it makes me think of that saying, bad things happen to good people.
Yeah.
The latter part of this is good things happen to bad people.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, and that's it's not necessarily it's not true all the time. It's a proverb in the sense of it's a generality. But it's one of those things that it seems like so often we can come up with an example with something that seems to fit that bill. Okay, in history, in our personal lives perhaps, where it seems like it's just not fair. Where this person who's evil or wicked, sinful, someone who doesn't care about God, somebody who doesn't care about the Bible, and yet it seems like all the good stuff happens to them. And not necessarily even that they're cheating or causing it to happen to them. It just like life happens. And they seem to be the winner in life here. And yet those of us who try to do what God wants, sometimes it seems like we get the short end of the stick. And yet Solomon says this is a vanity that occurs on... Does Solomon blame God for this? Do people sometimes blame God for this? Yeah. But Solomon, in all of his wisdom, he does not, in fact, God isn't even mentioned here in verse 14. He refers to the righteous and the just. He said God isn't involved in the sense that God is deliberately blessing the wicked and deliberately causing harm to come to the righteous. God's not doing that. Sometimes these things happen, and certainly if you're wicked and you don't abide by any certain rules or character, then you kind of get to create the rules as you go along, and certainly that's going to kind of help you get into wherever you want to be because you just kind of do what you want. And if the rules don't apply to you, you can kind of get away with things. Snoop.
Yeah, well, when the evil are blessed, they don't tend to thank God either.
You're right.
So God's kind of left out of all. Either he gets blamed and not thanked.
You're right, yeah.
And still not thanked.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. Anything through verse 14? Yes or no?
We want to live our lives as if individually I'm the only one and every decision will go my way or there will be a direct result. But there are other forces at work and I'm not the only one. There are other people involved in relationships, in the economy, and whatever you want to say. So, no, it's not always going to go down this direct action and the expected outcome.
Right. Right. And ultimately, as Solomon's building up here at the latter half of chapter 8, really, ultimately, this is what he's talking about. He's talking about things that happen in life and the ultimate end of those things, how that we can't control them. There is absolutely nothing we can do to control the outcomes of anything. And this kind of goes hand in hand with something we remind ourselves often and need to continue to remind ourselves that ultimately the only thing I control is me. No matter how much of an illusion I think I have in terms of a grasp or a handle on things that are going on my family, on the personal economics, whatever, we're not in control. And as especially for some of us, certain personalities, there's like almost a obsessive need to be able to control something. And those of you, you know who you are. I have a bit of that too. Or I just got to control something. Maybe it's something little. At least I have control of this. But ultimately, all we control is me, myself, and I. That's it. That's the only thing we have control over. Snoopy?
Well, and in that control, we have to learn to submit.
Submit, that's right.
You know, because I can be in control and not be in obedience.
Right, that's right.
So I need to control myself and the things I do so that I am in subjection.
That's right. That's a great delineation to make. And that brings out the definition of meekness specifically. You know, a lot of times people kind of misunderstand the concept or the definition of meekness. Meekness is having the ability to do something, but choosing not to for a greater purpose. Okay? I may have the ability or the opportunity to do something, but because God has told me that I need to submit, I am going to yield my ability or opportunity in order to abide by what God wants me to do. Even though I may have the control to be able to do something, I choose not to. And the way Vines has described it, defines meekness, it's like having all the power of a horse, and yet with that bridle, you're able to make him go, make him stop, make him turn every which way. You have all that power under your control, and yet it's brought under control. It's brought under control. I guess that's my word. Yeah, Snoopy.
And using that example, the person that's riding that horse or doing that horse, they're not going to treat the horse harshly because they will get a better behavior if they treat it, and they don't use too much bridle on that horse.
Yeah.
They use just enough to get the horse to go and not more than they need.
Right. Right. Even though they have the ability to abuse it, they still contain themselves to do what needs to be done. Yeah, that's a good point. Anything else through verse 14? Yes, sir.
Solomon so often in this book draws out of us the desire for justice,
Yeah.
for the wicked to get what they deserve, for the righteous to get what they deserve. And it's so frustrating when we don't see that. And God tells us to leave that to Him many times, to trust in Him. In Isaiah, there's the promises of those who desire justice will get justice. They will see justice when the kingdom comes. And Jesus, I think, is referring to that in the Beatitudes when He says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness," or justice. Those two words are so closely intertwined.
Yeah.
The kingdom, if we will trust in God and leave this in His hands, we will get the justice, the righteousness that we hunger and thirst for.
Right. Right. You know, it's amazing how embedded, ingrained into human nature it is for the good guys to win. I mean, barring trilogies, okay, almost every movie that has a protagonist or group of protagonists and an antagonist or group of antagonists, the good guys are supposed to always win. Okay? And the majority of movies, at least the movies that do well, ultimately, maybe at the end of the third movie, but in the end, the good guy wins. Okay, that's just the way it is. That's the way it works. That's what we want to see. And it makes us feel good. It makes us feel inspired. But there's something within human nature that seeks that out. Now, of course, the definition of justice in a very broad sense is good versus bad. Okay? Wicked and evil versus just and right. And in this case, what Solomon's describing is ultimately those who are with God and those who are against God. Okay, the justice that only God can dispense. Justice that you and I are not able to take into our own authority. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. And sometimes it can be so frustrating waiting on God to do what He's going to do. Not necessarily even in this life, but in the ultimate judgment. That sometimes it can wear on us when we see maybe somebody who has made it their life's goal to make us miserable, for instance. The bad guy. Not get what that bad guy deserves. And that's when we have to be reminded of what Solomon himself observed. Listen, it's not always going to go the way you think it should under the sun. But there is someone who is in control of under the sun and above the sun and everything else. And God will make sure that justice is made. Yes?
Because that's so ingrained in us, it causes me to think about Christ.
Yeah.
Totally innocent. And all the terrible, just
I know.
pain beyond belief that was done to him. And yet he never said a harsh word. He never struck out at anybody. He just stood there and took it.
One of the things I think about when we take the Lord's Supper is, in addition to the pain and the suffering that Jesus endured, was just the sin against justice that took place. In that, just as Isaiah prophesied, he opened not his mouth to defend himself. He said some words to Pilate. Okay, he didn't defend himself. He didn't try to get out of it. And even when he was being beaten and mocked, saying, prophesy to us, who struck you? Jesus could very well have said who struck him. And yet he didn't. And all of that, it makes you wonder how much of that human nature within Jesus, knowing he had the power and the ability, he himself said to call 10,000 angels, and yet to refuse to do that in light of such treatment, when he could have meted out justice. That just, it amazes me, because as a human being, that would be, I can't imagine just how tempting that must have been for him to keep silent and to stay in control, knowing that there was an ultimate goal, an ultimate plan in the end for why all this was happening. He knew what that plan was. He knew he had to do what he was doing. I saw a hand back there somewhere. Lisa?
Yeah. And it wasn't just physical, as you were saying, keeping silent. There was psychological abuse going on.
Yeah.
And most of us, if someone hits us, we're like, okay, you're excused or whatever. But say something against us, call us a bad name, or, that almost feels more unjust than accidentally getting hit or whatever, right? And so the amount of self-control.
Well, and for at least 8 hours, too. It's not like this just happened within 30 minutes. This happened at the... this happened at the end of Thursday night, into Friday. This was at least, I calculated, at least 8 hours worth of, and there were a total of 4 trials altogether. By Herod, by the Jews, and by Pilate twice. 4 trials over the period of 8 hours, and then being beaten and scourged. It just, yeah. Good points, Snoopy. And crucified. That's right. Yeah. And then after and that's not even including the 8 hours. So after that, then to be hung on a cross for hours. Yeah. Anything else to verse 14? Yes, sir.
It seemed to me in this verse is the frustration that keeps psychologists, psychiatrists in business.
Yeah.
We want to figure it out. He starts and ends this verse saying it's a vanity.
Yeah.
And that's what it is. And the the next verse, he's going to tell us about the contentment that you can live with to let all this go.
Right.
As it happens.
Right. And even to a certain extent, there are different aspects of our psyches that can bring about depression, that can bring about sadness. All of that sometimes have links within our worldview, the way we see the situations in our life. In particular, the things that we can't control, the things that aren't turning out the way we want them to, and the way we view those, the way we filter those things can often cause us pain, not necessarily just physical or mental and emotional pain, the things that we see. And being able to let it go is one of the hardest things as human beings that we can possibly do. And yet, this is the very reason why Solomon writes the things that he writes, is to remind the righteous and the wise that ultimately letting it go, you're letting it go because it's already in God's hands. It always was. It was never in yours. Ultimately, what are you letting go? You didn't have control to start with. Ultimately, you're letting go of a dream, of an ideal, when in fact you never had control of it to begin with. Yeah, just as Nolan mentioned, verse 15. So this is, and there's going to be three main conclusions that Solomon's going to come to because of these facts. The facts that man doesn't have control, and sometimes the wicked end up being on the winning end of things. I commended enjoyment because a man has nothing better under the sun than to eat, drink, and be merry. For this will remain with him in his labor all the days of his life, which God gives him under the sun. Keep in mind, he's talking about the righteous. He's talking about the wise. That this is where ultimately they must put themselves. And the idea of contentment is a key component of this idea that Solomon's trying to get across. Happiness, and of course we talked about happiness and joy and contentment and how the three are interconnected and how they are different. Happiness is happiness is an emotion. It comes, it goes, sometimes it has reason, sometimes it doesn't have reason. But happiness is a very fluid thing. Contentment comes because I realize, in fact, the term in the New Testament literally means I am sufficient. God has made me sufficient for today. That's literally what it means. It doesn't mean, it doesn't take into account the next month, the next year, the next 10 years. God has made me sufficient for today because of what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 6. Take no thought for tomorrow. Tomorrow's going to have its own troubles, its own cares. You take care of today and focus on today. Be sufficient today. And then tomorrow, you can address the issues of tomorrow and be sufficient for tomorrow. So contentment, though, is entirely bound up in the idea of joy. Joy is an attitude. It is a mindset. I can be entirely unhappy and still be joyous. I can be unhappy in the moment over something that happened that's sad. But I can still be joyous in knowing that God not only has blessed me in the past, but as He will continue to be with me and bless me. In fact, the term joy or rejoice, the rejoice is a verb of acknowledging blessings of God. Joy, I recognize that God has blessed me and He's with me and He's going to be with me. That's joy. And so when Solomon describes this, I commended enjoyment. He's not just describing happiness per se. He's describing something deeper, because a man has nothing better under the sun. It's not to say that there aren't times for recreation, that sometimes we aren't afforded luxuries in our lives, that it can maybe increase our, what we sometimes call quality of life in terms of our enjoyment. But here's what Solomon boils it down to, because ultimately this is what man has. He has the ability to be full, to eat and to drink. Okay, there's no reference to alcohol. There's no suggestion of alcohol here. That some people read that into that, and that's not what he's describing. To eat and drink and be merry. What he's describing is not sometimes this kind of gets related to things that Paul says about let us eat and drink for tomorrow we die. Okay, the idea that that the dead do not rise, 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And if that's the case, then what's the point of anything? Solomon's describing just being content and acknowledging the blessings of God in that I have the means to be sufficient. I have the means to take care of myself. I can eat, I can drink, and I can have the blessings that God has given me today. It may not be everything that I'd like to have, but you know what? The things I do have, it could be worse. I could be like Job and have lost it all. And so I can eat and drink and be merry. This is what God has given me today. For this will remain with him in his labor all the days of his life which God gives him under the sun. Ultimately, this is the one thing man has that he can count on, in the sense that contentment cannot be taken by man. Contentment can't be destroyed by nature. Contentment exists even when the things I want don't. Having joy, no man can take that away. Having an appreciation for the blessings God has given me, man can't strip you of that. He can't steal that from you. A hurricane can't come and flood it out. You can always have contentment in what you do and the blessings that come from it. This is what man has. And that's what ultimately Solomon makes mention of, is the fact you can't control everything else. You can't control if Amazon, the wish list you have on Amazon, if any of that stuff's ever going to go on sale. Can't control any of that. Can't control if something comes and wipes everything out that you have. Can't control the stock market. But you can control whether or not you choose to be content with the blessings you do have today. And that's all there is to it. And then you can be content with the blessings you have tomorrow, and the next day, and the next day, and the next day. Anything through verse 15. All right, verse 16. When I applied my heart to know wisdom and to see the business that is done on earth, even though one sees no sleep, day or night, then I saw all the work of God, that a man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. For though a man labors to discover it, yet he will not find it. Moreover, though a wise man attempts to know it, he will not be able to find it. Ironically, what Solomon discovers about the work of God is... what did he discover about the work of God? You can't know it. But isn't that a discovery in and of itself, in that those who are wise and those who seek to be righteous can give up on that futile effort of trying to know the works of God, trying to plan out everything to the smallest detail, to being able to control every situation and every scenario and every person? Isn't there a certain element, especially for those like Solomon, who sought to understand, who sought to, in some ways, control? Isn't there a sense of discovery in that now I know I can't? I can't know the works of God. I can't know the purposes for everything that happens under the sun. So I might as well just leave it alone. Be content and have joy in the things I have for today, because tomorrow they may not be here. And that's really ultimately what Solomon is kind of describing here. When he says, I applied my heart to know wisdom, to see the business that is done on earth, even though one sees no sleep day or night. What do you think he means by that? Though he sees no sleep, though one sees no sleep day or night.
This is all he thinks about.
Okay.
Understand.
Yeah.
Not day.
In the effort to be able to disseminate all that he observes, to be able to put reason and logic to everything, to find a pattern, this can be an obsession. And it is for some people. And certainly different aspects of it can be an obsession. And Solomon, when he applied his heart to know wisdom and to see the business done on the earth, though one sees no sleep day or night. No matter if you've got 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to constantly give to this effort, what's he going to come to? He says, I saw the work of God, that a man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. I'd like to suggest that in addition to the fact that Solomon discovered you can't know the works of God, and you can't put a pattern to it, and you can't predict it, what if he's also saying that in of itself, the fact that you can't know, is part of what God has done? That God has made it where man cannot know what's going to happen after him. He can't predict with certainty what's going to come. That he can't figure out the pattern of people and their behaviors. That God deliberately designed things that way so that no person could ever have that power. I mean, because if you could have that power, imagine, talk about throwing off balance everything. One person with the ability to determine the future, to figure out who's going to do what and when, to figure out what stocks are going to go up and go down, to know in advance everything. That's a godly ability. And God has made it where God has made it where no man, except for, we talked about the spiritual gifts, those who had the gifts of prophecy and so forth, but no man has that ability. And so the work of God is that man can't know the work of God.
This has been going on a long time.
Yeah.
That people are wanting to have that ability. Even to today, they create movies to fill that fantasy that we can't do.
Yep.
That, someone has that ability to figure things out, and it's been going on forever. It's a problem that man has that he tries to.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what Solomon is saying, don't waste your time.
Yeah.
This is a waste of time.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean man won't still try.
Right. It's interesting, the movies and the books that have some sort of aspect of time travel or ability to see the future, psychic ability to be able to read people's minds, that the one thing that they all have in common is that it gives this particular person an edge, an advantage, a means to be able to control more than what the average person can. You think about superpowers, you think about all of these different aspects that go beyond human nature. That's why they're called supernatural, because it's all an effort, like you said, to kind of fulfill that fantasy of knowing that we all are the same. That, aside from more of a kind of a spectrum of physical abilities, none of us have anything beyond what God has given to man. We all fit in that same spectrum.
And they make these movies so it satisfies us that have that want that we can go
Yeah.
and for a couple hours.
At least kind of pretend to be, what would it be like? Yep. Yep.
Satisfied.
Yep.
And here he talks about it several thousand years ago.
Oh, yeah.
The same thing man's always had in his mind.
Yeah. H.G. Wells hadn't read about the time machine yet in Solomon's time. Then I saw the work of God, that a man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun, for though a man labors to discover it, he will not find it. Moreover, though a wise man attempts to know it, he will not be able to find it. So no matter how wise or how knowledgeable we may be, we're never going to be able to figure out the things that happen, why they happen, how things fit, what's going to happen in the future because of it. It's not going to happen. Anything through verse 17? Yes, sir.
All of those things that you described, the superpowers, the super knowledge, the being able to see the future, they are all anti-faith in God.
Yeah, in some ways, yeah.
I think about Abraham and the statement that was made about him. He believed God, not he believed what God just told him.
Right.
He believed God.
Yeah.
And that's all he needed, because whatever God
That's true.
would be for his good.
And in a lot of ways, people, when you think about the idea of having these abilities, of going into the future, seeing the future, reading people's minds, it's all about being able to trust in what I can do and not trusting in the fact that God is in control. Even though God doesn't tell you what he's going to do, okay? I mean, think about Job. To me, the entire lesson, the entire message of the book of Job, overarching all the rest of them, is the fact that God never told Job why all that happened. Even though Job on many occasions asked, Lord, why is this happening? Why are you allowing this to happen to a righteous person? As far as we know, God never told him. And yet Job still came to the understanding, I have asked these questions that are too wonderful for me to know. I have overstepped my authority in questioning your wisdom, and I repent. That's what Job came to. He concluded he didn't need to know. He needed to trust that God knew, and that's all that really mattered. And so, yeah, in a lot of ways, what you talked about, the supernatural abilities and all this, in a lot of ways it's a desire to trust and control, and ultimately that's what control is being able to trust in something, to have control over it. That's more about the individual, and it has nothing to do with God. So, yes, Lisa?
Makes me think of all the attempts science has made to create life outside the womb.
Yeah.
They've never been able to do it.
Well,
They've done a lot, but not that.
Well, and even beyond that, to improve on the design of God. There have been efforts really since, the 40s and the 50s to make super soldiers and, to try to adjust genetic code and that sort of thing. And it's never resulted in anything good. And it goes to show how that God possesses certain realms of understanding that this is beyond us. It's beyond our ability to control. Yes, sir.
Michael, I mentioned it to you earlier this week, so this week in my biology class, the topic is microbiology, genetic modification. Anyways, I saw a couple of classmates post the same article, I guess recently in China. They genetically modified a baby, I think before it was born, embryos, to make the child less susceptible to HIV. And so this child will grow up with modified genes that will make it almost impervious to contracting HIV. However, they're already showing proof that it's going to make it even more susceptible to other diseases. So you can improve one thing, but it just made it weaker for everything else.
Yeah.
Because you can't do what God does.
No. All right. Anything else so far through verse 17? We'll stop there. We will pick up, not next Sunday. The next class in Ecclesiastes we'll pick up here at the end of chapter 8, and then we'll get into chapter 9. Thank you, everybody, for the thoughts and the comments.